Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's lecture. We have another candidate for our search in pastoral theology, and this evening we are delighted and excited to welcome the Reverend Mr. Zachary Moon. Zachary is no stranger to this community because he is a 2010 graduate from our Master Divinity program. He's an ordained clergy person who holds dual standing. He's ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and he's a licensed minister in the Religious Society of Friends. So he brings different traditions within his being that actually exemplify, express his commitments both to social justice and to the inner life. He is a PhD candidate at the Iliff School of Theology in Religious and Psychological Studies, also having earned his Bachelor of Arts in History from Vassar College in New York. He brings significant experience in the area of chaplaincy. He is a commissioned officer in the United States Navy, serving in the Chaplaincy Corps, and has been assigned to a division of the United States Marine Corps. Those who are not familiar, the Navy supplies the chaplains for the Marines. In addition to being a doctoral student, a doctoral candidate, he is also a published author. He has published the book Coming Home, Ministry That Matters with Veterans and Military Families, published by Chalice Press in 2015. And this is a text that is devoted to congregational life, helping congregations to actually confront the issues and take seriously what it means to do ministry with veterans and their families, to help folks to return to their homes, to help folks to be cared for while their loved ones are deployed in the uttermost parts of the world. I'd like to read for you a few statements that folks have regarding Zachary's being and his intellectual capacities. One person writes, Zachary has a strong pastoral identity, shaped through his impressive CPE training and years of serving the needs of others in a ministry of capacity. His dedication to the ministry of military chaplaincy is authentic and significant. He has brought keen insight about the military chaplaincy to his academic life and to courses where he has presented information about the chaplaincy and examples of the kinds of ministries chaplaincies or chaplains do. Another person writes, in his dissertation, Moon draws upon psychological studies of moral injury, moral emotions, and military identity formation. In religious and theological studies, he draws upon theological studies of war and pastoral theologian Elaine Graham's description of theology as performative knowledge, as well as the work of moral stress as inherently theological, a physiological and emotional stress response that constellates a lived theology of values, beliefs, and ways of coping internalized through family systems as well as intersecting systems of social oppressions like sexism, classism, and racism. Mr. Moon has demonstrated the ways that he brings fresh, progressive theological perspectives to military service in his book, Coming Home, Ministry That Matters with Veterans and Military Families. This book is written for congregations to help them understand how they need to do their work, their faith work, in order to truly welcome veterans and military families into congregations. So we're delighted to welcome him and to hear his thoughts on pastoral theology and what he might offer to us here at the Chicago Theological Seminary. Welcome, Zachary.
Can you hear me okay? As Dr. Butler noted, this is a homecoming of sorts, although I was remarking to President Hunt, everything has changed since I was a student here. So the kid who went off to college and came back and everybody lived in a different house. But that being said, I'm very grateful to have been invited to be considered for this position because of a deep, heart-connected sense I have to this community. And getting to begin my visit here earlier today in this space for community worship was particularly meaningful for me, coming back to this city and back to this community in a week where all of us, I think, are really carrying just very deep grief for the world in which we live. I hope that this presentation will do two things adequately well. I'd like to share a little bit about my scholarly work, and I'd like to share a little bit about my story. Having been where you all are sitting and heard some of these presentations myself, I always wanted to see a scholar in all of that. And so I hope that this presentation will offer that to us tonight. Here we go. My story begins here. Can you all read that t-shirt? So I grew up in a Quaker family in Berkeley, California. Both of my parents and most of my family's friends are committed activists and community organizers. Was born into a liberal family in a liberal religious tradition in probably the most liberal city in the United States. Can you all read that sign? It says, our weapons, so here these are nuclear weapons. Our nuclear weapons crucify the third world. So this was the 1980s. This was a kind of particularly important aspect of the peace movement at that time. So this community, the people who raised me, these were folks who were more likely to be carrying a sign like this than watching a football game. The work of peace and social justice within that context, they weren't abstractions for that community. They were these core values that we were trying to figure out how to live out in this world that was so often defined by violence. As I came into my own as a teenager, I started my own involvement in my own causes, most notably organizing and educating other young people like myself about the criminalization of urban dwelling young people who at that time in the 90s were being branded super predator children. And this was motivation for something that was very gently being called community policing, which was code language for a whole lot more police in particularly African American communities. We might know some of the legacy about that right now. After college, I delved back into that work of activism. I was working for nonprofit organizations on the West Coast and then in the South. And in both those cases, those were interfaith organizations. Our religious identity had something to do with the work for social justice that we were about. But it was during that work that I came to a turning point. I was doing this work because I was a person of faith. A person of faith who believed that justice-seeking and justice-building work was inextricable from my faith connection. But even as our work was publicly demanding nonviolent means of peace and justice and reconciliation, so often our rhetoric and our tactics were antagonistic, even combative. We saw those on the other side of these important issues as foolish and wrong-headed at best, and at worst, they were the embodiment of the evil that we were trying to overcome. And these expressions of our commitment and our passion for these issues just entrenched us further and further apart from these folks on the other side. We were right and they were wrong. They were our enemies. And before I could even sort of muster all of that in my mind, I found that my body and my soul were just getting so deeply fatigued. This work that I cared so much about that in some ways fed me in some very important ways. At the same time, I was also dragging around this fatigue, this tiredness, this deep, deep tiredness. So I kept wondering, what is that something that's missing here? What I came to think is that those long days of work were creating a new problem, even as we were seeking to resolve one. That liberal, conservative, discursive binary was too often a two-sided coin. Each side's actions were legitimizing the other's outrage, back and forth, and around and around we would go. And I wondered if there wasn't a different approach, an approach that would bring me closer to those folks that I was so certain were my enemies. And as a Quaker and a pacifist, the top of that enemy list were folks who were serving in the military. I didn't know any of those folks, or so I thought. Part of this journey has been about reconciling with my father, who's a Vietnam veteran, who never spoke about his military service because he became a Quaker when he got back from all that and never talked about it again. So I knew it, but I didn't have any knowledge of it. As far as I knew, as far as my Quakers and my Franciscans and all these good folks around me were telling me, the American military was the hand of this American empire around the world. It was the epitome of this evil. Steer clear of all that. And I gotta say, when I went looking, I wasn't really looking to love American military might here. That wasn't really what I was after. But I got to this place where I wondered if this faithful resistance to American war making, our seeming addiction to violence, if this different kind of approach to that resistance didn't have something that was everything to do with being in relationship with those folks that I had come to see as strangers or enemies even. So I waded in. Perhaps an unlikely place. I found myself at the bedsides in a VA hospital. And I'll tell you, I found any number of folks who were truly strangers to my worldview, and a number of folks who saw the world as I imagined my enemies would see the world. But I wasn't there to argue back and forth about those differences. I was there as a chaplain, and in that my role was different. I didn't need to win any of those arguments. I could just be here, embodying what I knew of God's love and mercy and grace. I was here to listen with compassion, and I was here to connect in relationship and try to figure out how to accompany this person right here in front of me. So, you remember that little kid you just looked at? So 5 years ago, I took a step, believe me, I never would have imagined. I commissioned as a military chaplain, and I headed off to naval officer training and chaplain basic training. And to this day, that world of the military, a world that I still inhabit on some days, and in some ways am always inhabiting, is still deeply uncomfortable for me. I have not yet, and I don't imagine I ever will, truly feel at peace in that space. But I've come to think that that's okay. That actually embodying the contestedness of that world has something to do with the kind of ministry I can do with my brothers and sisters in that space. And it's my work with military service members and their families that fuels now my scholarly projects. And in an urgent sense, my teaching, my writing, my research are all very much accountable to those lives, those brothers and sisters who've meant so much to me. Through this work as a chaplain, I have again and again come face to face with the human cost of war making. And its aftermath is ugly and messy, chaotic, and heartbreaking. But all of that, I believe, is deserving of scholarly attention, and perhaps even some concerted theological education. So that's a little bit of the background that I hope will bring some order to the rest of this presentation. So as a scholar leaning into this topic and these kind of cluster of topics, I'm very grateful that a number of scholars have picked this up in recent decades. The first of those who must be named into this space is the work of Dr. Judith Herman, whose book here, Trauma and Recovery, I think really changed the way that we thought about post-traumatic stress. At the time, she made this very controversial argument, which was to make visible the trauma of survivors of sexual assault and combat trauma. And she lifted them up together. And she said, look, these brothers and sisters are reacting in some similar ways. And what they need by way of support and recovery is also very similar. Perhaps we wouldn't think of that as being controversial now, but even just a few decades ago, that was a very controversial thing to say, and she got some serious pushback for it. But her work was also significant in this way. unlike many clinicians who have come to this work, she was willing to plainly name the political and moral dimensions of this trauma. This wasn't just a matter of what happens in a therapeutic context in a narrow sense. She was saying this stuff is significant in a broader kind of way and demands our attention in that kind of way. And in that way, she remains just a key figure in this work. But as often happens when somebody writes a book that really says what needs to be said, nobody did anything about it for quite a while. Another clinician, Dr. Jonathan Shea, about a decade later, picks up the conversation a little bit. He comes out with these 2 books in which he reads these ancient texts, the story of Achilles and the Iliad and the story of the Odyssey, and he reads these as being illustrations in a kind of comparative way with the conversations and stories that he's heard from Vietnam veterans that he's working with at the Boston VA, where he serves as a clinician. And in the midst of this, he coins the term moral injury. And so I'm going to spend some time with that conceptual framework because the scholarly work that I'm doing right now is very much about trying to write into that discourse and hopefully help it to grow and breathe in some good ways. In 2009, some VA clinicians got together and officially defined moral injury, and that initial definition is the first one listed there. They said that moral injury would arise from perpetuating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. And those folks have continued to work with those definitions within their context. And a couple of those definitions are also included here as well. And the insights of this conceptual framework around moral injury were very much coming from their practical work with veterans. And what was happening again and again and again until they had to sit down and say, what is this that we're looking at, was that they kept meeting with folks who had what we knew diagnostically as PTSD symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. The sort of 3 big ones around there is always being on edge, having intrusive thoughts, and being kind of amped up in a significant way, particularly kind of emotionally, right? So those were those diagnostic criterion around PTSD. But as they stayed in the conversation a little bit longer, the story behind those symptoms didn't really sound like PTSD. Because the number 1 criterion around PTSD, and what you'll see there in that first column, is what we would call PTSD. Okay, it will be a traumatic event that endangers one's life or sense of safety, not only to yourself, but maybe also to an important other. Okay, but it's an overwhelming fear experience that generates PTSD. Without fear, without that being the kind of critical emotional experience there, that actually isn't PTSD. But the symptoms can look just like that. So as they were hearing these stories, they were saying, what's going on here? Because we're hearing these stories and it's not about fear, but we're seeing these symptoms. So what is this? So here's where we are so far. We've gotten to the place where we can at least differentiate 4 different sources for these kind of stress injuries that can potentially be showing all of the same symptoms in this, but as I say, the underlying causes, the story underneath those symptoms can be different. So that second one, now this is the stress injury of what happens when you use less than 1% of American citizens to fight 10 plus years of war. Wear and tear, it's a beautifully kind of gentle name to describe what happens when you're deployed year after year after year after year. And the cost that takes not only onto the bodies and the resilience of military service members, but also just as much on their families and on their communities. The folks that we have asked again and again to deploy have essentially been disappeared from our communities because they've been deployed so consistently for so many years. So without any of this other stuff, wear and tear all by itself, this kind of thing could generate what we think of as being PTSD symptoms. Now the third and the fourth column, I want to illuminate here because particularly thinking about pastoral theology and thinking about the context of ministry, thinking about experiencing traumatic levels of loss and the necessary grief in that experience, as well as moral injury, ought to be challenging us in the context of ministry to be thinking very actively about how we're engaging with that. And as I say, not just looking at the symptoms and say, oh, that looks like PTSD. I read that article in New York Times. I know what this is. You know, you should just go on down to the VA. Because if we can, if it's all right to do so, if we can hang in that conversation a little bit longer and hear a little more of that story, we might find out, well, this actually isn't PTSD. This actually has to do with the fact that this person has got some grief that they had to defer, maybe deployment after deployment after deployment, and is trying to offer to you, his or her chaplain or his or her minister or his or her teacher, and say, I'm trying to process this right now. And yeah, I've got these symptoms, but what's underneath that, what I really need some response to, has to do with this grief that I don't know where it belongs. And then that fourth category is what we've now come to call moral injury. So in just the last few years, some theologians and some ethicists and some philosophers have started to join into this conversation on military moral injury. Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock and Dr. Gabriella Latini, whose book is there on the left. Their book came out in 2012, Soul Repair, and it was a landmark contribution to this conversation and really served as a call to other theologians to get involved in this conversation. I was remembering with President Hunt earlier today that the two of us were able to be present at an event that Dr. Brock organized there around moral injury and conscience in war. And that was only 5 or 6 years ago, I think. So all of this work is still very much in the process of becoming. I also listed Nancy Sherman's book. She's a philosopher at Georgetown University, and she's had a couple books out, including this 2015 After War text here. But my sense is that this moral injury discourse that you all have just been very quickly introduced to is at a crossroads. So now that I've introduced you to this, I'll now tell you where I think maybe we could go and kind of grow into this. And at least loosely, I would say that the work of Dr. Jonathan Shea and this work in these preceding years maybe kind of represents a kind of first wave of this discourse. But there's a number of areas that have really been left unaddressed in this first wave. And so in the ways that we can sort of imagine a second wave of inquiry around this helping to kind of correct some of the blind spots that have occurred here. And I'd like to sort of lean into some of that because that's really where a lot of my scholarly energy is at these days. So I shared some of those throwback pictures earlier, and now I will risk further embarrassment by showing you some of my original artwork, or much of my original artwork. We'll start with this one. So this first wave of discourse on moral injury has paid attention to the warfighter. This is my guy in uniform, okay, for roughly speaking. And has focused on them as the subject and his or her actions or inactions in the context of a combat situation as being the kind of generative event that would create moral injury. Now, Dr. Shea differs from that a little bit in that he actually wants to kind of point our attention not toward the warfighter, but actually to the chain of command and say, if there is a commanding officer who gets his or her soldiers or Marines to do something that they ought not to do, and the kind of moral dilemma of that. So his direction is really saying we need to reform the military institution as such. But some of those colleagues in those definitions that we read earlier, as well as Dr. Brock's work, is saying much more, let's kind of bring it down and really engage with the personal experience of this. And those kind of acute, specific events could include war atrocities, killing of civilians, handling of dead bodies. These are the kinds of experiences that they have in mind when they're thinking about how someone would come to have moral injury. But I would argue that what needs further exploration here are a few things that I'd like to lean into. The first is that I would argue that in the way that we're talking about this conceptual framework, we haven't actually clearly defined what we mean by moral. And so some of the work that I'm trying to do right now, I'm trying to kind of hone in on a better definition of that so that we're not kind of having 16 different conversations thinking that we're having one conversation. And the terminology that I'm developing to try to articulate a picture of moral identity that might be useful in the context of this scholarly work is that of moral orienting systems. And how I would define that is a matrix of values, beliefs, and behaviors that are fluid to a degree. They're socially, relationally constructed. And that in that sense, each of us uniquely has our own moral orienting system, and yet it is at one time both situated within ourselves, but also has everything to do with the ecology of important relationships that we're a part of. So this, in some ways, is a sort of corrective to imagining that any of us is a sort of individual body, just sort of moving around the wilderness all by ourselves. I don't see any evidence that has ever been the case. So I think our sense of moral orientation has to account for the social relationality of all of this. Now, this moral orienting system is in no way, shape, or form static. One of the things that it's doing is it is generating certain assumptions and expectations. And now those are regarded to who we estimate that we are, who we estimate other folks might be, and then it would also extend to existential or metaphysical kind of questions as well. And this moral orienting system might be embedded within a religious tradition, and it might be inspired from a religious tradition, but that is not necessary, and those two things are not necessarily synonymous. Now, that point in particular is particularly key for me working as a chaplain, okay? Most of the folks that I work with in the military do not come from a religious background. But I would not say that they do not have a moral orienting system, because to make that kind of implication would to say, well, then they couldn't have moral suffering, right? So some of this is about how do we really find the kind of conceptual framework that is able to function adequately in an acknowledged pluralistic context. So in a sense, we've got to take that step kind of past the kind of multi-faith or interfaith conversation to then even think, well, we've got all these folks here who are asking questions that I've asked, and maybe they're asking those questions in different ways than I would ask those questions, but boy, I think those questions are are pretty significant kind of moral questions. So that's really what I'm after here. I would say all of this really are matters of theological anthropology. We've got to think about how we're conceptualizing of both who we are, but how we are participating in human communities to really do this kind of deeper work around moral injury. So part of where I see a need to kind of provide some corrective is that if we talk about moral injury as something that happened once you were in uniform, once you were overseas, once you were in combat and sort of qualified in all these ways, we also fail to appreciate that there was any part of that story that happened before that date and time. So part of it is we've got to go back and we've got to say, who is that guy, right? That guy who, unshaven, cap on backwards, wearing, all of that, right? Because that part of the story is also important to how we would imagine that somebody sitting right in front of us might be experiencing moral anguish in this kind of severe sense. To imagine that could just strictly come from one bad day in combat, I think misses the larger picture in a very significant way. And that's a trap that we sometimes fall into within a kind of Western medical model that, again, seems to just kind of perceive symptoms and ways of addressing symptoms, but often just misses everything else in the process of that kind of approach. I'll share with you that most of the Marines that I serve with as a chaplain have significant trauma histories before they ever put on this uniform. So to imagine that I could accompany someone who is suffering in the aftermath of trauma without attending to those trauma histories would just be, it would be a cruel way to really approach that work. But I would also say that it's important to both attend to those trauma histories, but then also to think about all of the parts of the story, the families, the friends, the mentors, the religious communities where that's appropriate, who came to shape the moral orienting system of this person before their military service. That those pieces of the story are significant as well, and we need to be able to hear those parts of the story. And where that really becomes important is then when we think about what happens in the process of taking that individual to get to be that individual. And for any of you with military background experience, or even if you've just seen Full Metal Jacket, you might have a kind of picture in your mind that military training is a very, very intense, I would say ritualized, kind of program of identity formation. And I think we ought to attend to it as such. I think we should, and maybe this is your work, Dr. Haldeman, or maybe you and I can work on this together, right? To think about the ritual significance of military training, and to think, I would say, in terms of ritual, symbol, language, all of that stuff. You want a case study, you go check out the United States Marine Corps. And I don't really need to say this, but this is not the kind of moral identity formation that you receive at Chicago Theological Seminary, yes? Where there's a bunch of, wise folks, giving you wise books and you have wise conversations. The boot camp experience directly and immediately is intended to tear away what is familiar to you as a civilian. And that's not just a negative process, because what is replaced into that empty space is a new sense of identity. And both that subtraction and that addition are deemed essential to this project, because if you hold on to the moral orienting system that allowed you to function within that civilian context, you won't be able to function in this context. So here I'm bringing in some of my reading of social psychology here. We've got to think about the situatedness of what's happening here. That is significant in what's going on. So what's happening in that basic training or boot camp experience is you're losing both these outward physical kind of features that would define you or make you distinct, right? Clean-shaven face, certain kind of haircut, certain kind of posture, certain kind of language, certain kind of images, certain kind of values. All of these pieces are being reoriented during this time. And again, this isn't just for, sort of, let's see how we can take, this dirt bag over here and turn him into, this squared away Marine. This has everything to do with being able to function and survive in these very, very high stress situations. That drill sergeant, that drill instructor is not yelling at that person, because his mother didn't love him enough as a child. That may be a part of it, but that's happening because what's being, in some ways, and again, in a very ritual sense, what's happening there is a kind of fabrication of a high stress environment. And the idea is that we can actually, and this happens, we can actually train our entire physiological system to normalize that kind of high stress situation. And being shouted at and having, unkind things said to you is really nothing compared to what it's like to receive mortar fire or be blown up by an IED. So it's really just thinking about kind of getting us to that place. But here's the problem. I think we have some societal idea that boot camp is this intense thing. But then I see my guys trying to come home post-deployment. And the way folks get responded to is what I would call the time machine paradigm. It is, thank you for your service. Now travel back in time and re-become the person you were before. If you want to see a just perfect spot-on narration of that, I would encourage you to watch the last 15 minutes of American Sniper, brought to us by our great American patriot, Clint Eastwood, who tells us, 2 hours of bullets flying and bombs exploding. And then he comes home and he's all jacked up and he's got these stress symptoms that we were talking about earlier. And then the screen fades to black. And then the lights come up and he's happy and jovial and affectionate with his wife and picking his kids up and playing and everything's fine. And that's it. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking at that and I'm saying, well, what the hell just happened when he turned the lights off? Because that's where all the work had to take place. Because this time machine doesn't exist. But here's what happens. We respond to folks like that, and we say, well, if you couldn't find your time machine, you must have a mental health disorder. You should go on down to the VA and get some medication for that. Those are the two pathways for coming home that we've offered folks. So when you hear stories about veterans who very late in life maybe talking to their hospice chaplain, start talking about their war experience all the time, I hear those stories and I think, yep, that person never found that time machine and just held all that in their body all these many decades. Probably killed them in one way or another. Because we didn't allow for the space to be either you're crazy or you're a time traveler. And we got to find something that offers something in between that. To me, I think part of that, particularly when we think about engaging the moral anguish that sometimes comes as a part of military service, is to really be very intentionally engaged with the moral emotions that generate this moral anguish. And to think about them not just as what sometimes my colleagues would call negative moral emotions, right? Like shame, that's a bad one, right? You shouldn't do that. toxic guilt, well, you should get over that, right? Disgust, rage, anger problems, right? All those get clustered into this kind of these are the negative emotions, or we call them the negative moral emotions. And one of the things that's really lost there is that all of those emotions have a pro-social function to them. What I mean by that is there's something in there that's trying to get our attention that says there is some harm or potential harm in this relationship, and we got to figure that out. And maybe I feel shame because I did you wrong, or maybe I feel angry at you because I perceive that you did me wrong. So what do we usually do with those emotions? This is why we call them negative, right? We usually do all kind of negative things about those emotions, right? I feel bad because I did you wrong. I'm going to go drink about that. Or even just, I'm going to put a whole lot of distance in this relationship. Right? But that's not all those emotions have for us. And when we approach them as something that ought to be gotten over, we're missing a big portion of what needs to happen there. Because we got to be able to listen to that part of that shame and that part of that survivor guilt that has everything to do with coming back into those social relational ecologies that we desperately need as people. We got to be looking for that kind of stuff. But moral injury has a way of fracturing these important relationships. And they fracture them not only between important interpersonal relationships, they can fracture our relationship with our inner sense of goodness. And in certain contexts, for certain individuals, they are absolutely fracturing of our relationship with a sense of God's goodness, God's persistence in the face of suffering. All of that can be thrown into doubt and crisis. And all of that may be the kind of stuff that we as bearers of compassion and care and counseling and that kind of ministry space, that's what we may need to be speaking to, is how can a balm be experienced in those kind of broken relationships. So I said at the beginning that in the title of this presentation that there were going to be some theologies of hope. So I want to get on to some of the hopefulness, because I know a lot of this is heavy stuff. So one of the things that's particularly important in my work, and I always want to name as a part of thinking about how do we get folks to a place where we can even do this work. Because when those kind of broken relationships are going on, there may be a sense of despair and disbelief that healing is even possible in that space. The number one place we have to start is with compassion and practicing compassion, embodying compassion in that space. So whether I'm working with students, doing trauma and moral anguish kind of work in the classroom, or whether I'm doing that as a chaplain, always, always, always the first place that we have to start in that work is by locating and identifying the kinds of practices that connect us with compassion. Compassion for ourselves, compassion for one another, and feeling, I would say in a number of cases, how do we feel God's compassion for us, God's presence with us, God's willingness to be with us in the midst of all seasons of our life. In some contexts, those practices may have religious or spiritual structure to them. They don't need to. And we need to have the kinds of intentionality that we allow folks to name those practices for themselves, not prescribe those practices for them, if they're going to be truly effective in that space. Second, I've come to believe that moral anguish cannot be fully or adequately addressed through talk-based therapies. The reality is that traumatic experiences disrupt the very mental cognition that a person needs to be able to verbally communicate. And so in so many cases, asking someone repeatedly to talk about their feelings about something like that is re-traumatizing or further entrenches that person in a sense of despair that they They can't meet your expectation. They can't step up to that invitation. Why can't I do that? Why can't I do that? More shame, more guilt, more sense of what a person can't do. So here's something. Y'all may have heard this. Yoga-based therapy has shown to be as effective in reducing traumatic stress injuries as talk-based therapy. Yoga-based therapy with no talk component. Pet therapy, cuddling with a puppy, same thing. Spending an afternoon taking care of a horse and riding a horse, same thing. Okay, now each of those therapies are accessing a different kind of healing modality. All of them are bringing these folks back into relationship with the goodness, the innate goodness of their bodies, right? I mean, nothing like a puppy to remind you about the goodness of your body. You know, this is basic kind of stuff, but it's right there at the heart of what we're talking about here. But remember that conversation when we were talking about military training, okay? And I said sort of flippantly, it's not like CTS education, right? Military training is embodied kind of training. Yeah, those folks are shouting at you, but they're not really trying to communicate something to you in that moment. What's really being communicated to you through those intense physical endurance and exertion practices, through doing close order drill where you're all moving together around a drill field, that's about getting that stuff inscribed on your bodies. So if we're talking about how can we carefully, lovingly help people transition post-deployment, that work has got to be embodied, I would say, across the board in terms of how we're engaging with people. Military service members have been indoctrinated through that military training into a different kind of moral identity. And it's a moral identity that has everything to do with feeling relationally connected to your unit members. Unlike American society that so privileges and prioritizes individual feel-goodedness, that is not what the military is about. So the social alienation that sometimes leads to veterans suffering when they get back often has to do with feeling disconnected from that kind of community. And I would say to you that I believe and hope for a time when our religious communities are able to embody and demonstrate some alternatives to an American individualist, consumerist culture where we actually show up together for worship and demonstrate that we believe that my survival has something to do with your survival. That's when I know that we're having church, because we are showing up in that space like that. And I have talked to so many veterans who went to church straight away when they got back, because that was the community that had raised them, and they knew that they needed some love and some relational connection. And they sat down there in that pew, and they heard the preacher talking about John and there is no greater love than this. And they looked around that congregation, that sanctuary, and they said, none of these people love anybody in this room like that. But I've experienced something like that. And so you'll hear veterans say so often, I can only trust another veteran to share my story with, to do this work with, for all of the reasons that we just named there. But consider this. We are in relationship all the time with people who are different than us. Somehow, when it comes to veterans and civilians, we've all resigned ourselves to these being two different communities. And the example that just comes to mind so immediately for me is I'm a man married to a woman. My wife has been a woman every day of her life. There will always be a limitation to how much I can even fully comprehend what her experience in this world is like. But I will do everything in my power to listen to her and try to understand that. And when I can't understand it, to hang in there anyway, because I love her and because I have made that commitment. But I don't hear civilians saying that about veterans. I hear civilians saying, well, that experience is just not my experience, so you probably go rather talk to a veteran, wouldn't you? Now, how do you think that would go over in my house if I said that to my wife? And I have no doubt that there are probably some days where she's already talked herself blue in the face, that she would rather go talk to one of her girlfriends about what she's talking about. But to imagine that veterans and civilians cannot have meaningful relationships with each other because this is just a difference of experience that's too wide to bear makes no sense to me. We've just told ourselves that story for so long. And believe me when I say that story is killing veterans right now at this very moment in this country. Particularly the folks that I serve with right now, because such a small number of them have served in uniform. If they're telling themselves that story, I can only talk to another veteran. And these are Marines, so they say, I can only talk to another Marine. Their interpersonal world has narrowed to this. But also believe this, the first time they have a meaningful connection with somebody who's not a Marine, this is what happens to their interpersonal world. Because they can't tell that story the same way anymore. Because I had that great conversation with Scott that one day. And if I could trust Scott, maybe I could trust anybody in this room. That sounds like a great future to me. That's the kind of future that I want for these folks. I'm running a little long on time, but I want to just really leave us with this sense that this is theological work, that a lot of what I've shared tonight could have just as easily been to a group of social workers or a group of clinicians. But there's a part of this work, the moral significance and the moral problemness of war making and war fighting, the way that we do that in this context, is theologically significant. And we need to be involved in that work. So I want to quickly share a kind of a theology, a kind of a story, a metaphor that's been particularly useful to me, working in a pluralistic context, to kind of reimagine theologically what this journey to recovery is. So this is my metaphor. Our moral injury is kind of like a house. And it's not a house that we built all by ourselves. It's a house that our families, our friends, our mentors, folks in our religious community said, you know what, young man? You should build it like this. And so when I was young, I built it like that. And I got this house. And I was feeling pretty good about that house. Oh. Traumatic stress can do this to your house. A little bit of stress can kind of put some strain on that house and get you wondering, get you worried about that house a little bit. But big, overwhelming, traumatic stress can shake that house all the way down to its foundations. The kind of moral anguish that we've been talking about tonight, folks' house looks like this, and they are standing right here, looking at this house, and they're saying to themselves, how did this happen to my house? And they're looking around the neighborhood, and maybe everybody else's house looks just fine. So they're saying to themselves, why did this happen to my house, not to anybody else's house? And they want to know, what are they going to do next? And they start thinking, maybe I didn't deserve a house in the first place. And the kind of spiritual exile that folks can feel after that kind of traumatic experiences. But this story is a story of hope for me, because it claims the possibility that new building is possible. So I ask these three, can you get me back here? One more. There it is. These three discernment questions. When you're standing looking at that rubble that used to be your house, what in the midst of all this junk is worth keeping? We don't have to start from nothing. There's stuff in that house that's worth keeping, worth reprising and holding on to, maybe using it in a different way the next time, but something that's valuable there. What's that stuff? What's the stuff here that had no business in your house or anybody else's house? Say, thank you, merciful Lord, for showing me this. I can leave this behind. And then that third question, and this is the most important question: who do I need to help me build this house? And this is such a critical question because I have been in experiences, and you may have been in experiences, where someone whose house has broken down will come to you and will say, my house is broken down. Please rebuild it for me. And it's sometimes really hard when you see somebody in that much pain to not jump into the driver's seat and get to work rebuilding their house for them. But you know what? The house that you build for somebody else isn't going to hold up too well next time that storm comes around. So what we got to say is, I can't build the house for you. You got to be the designer of that house. It's your house. But I can help you build it. And let's figure out who else can help. Because we don't have to imagine that we have to put all of the responsibility and all the how's this going to get done on that person, right? That might seem overwhelming. You know, I don't know how to do plumbing, but I know somebody who does know how to do plumbing. Let's get that person to be a part of this team. That person's not going to design the house, but that person might be able to just do this part on my terms. And that might have this house be the kind of house that I can live in for a long time. So that's some of my theology of hope when it comes to doing this work, is that I'm always trying to offer those kinds of senses of possibility for folks. That even moral trauma and trauma at its most intense forms don't necessarily need to be stories where death is the end of that story. That I've witnessed face to face so many resurrection stories, so many rebuilding stories, and I hope that we can come to a place where we can have the eyes to see that kind of potential, even in the faces of folks who have been through unimaginably horrific kind of trauma in their lives, because I've seen that kind of turnaround happen too. So with what little time we have remaining, I want to just open it up a little bit so we can have a little bit more of a back and forth. And so let's move into that time now.
Yes, thank you very much, Chaplain Moon. For the students who are present, please remember you have evaluation forms that we need you to fill out before you leave. Questions?
So could you, and this is not going to be a question that's going to be a short answer, but could you give a short answer so someone else might be able to ask a question? Could you talk about moral injury in terms of Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, Chicago, and Laquan McDonald?
Yeah, so there's kind of two pieces to that. I would say the short answer to that is, I think the kinds of activism, public lament, outrage that we can express, that those are all active, embodied responses to moral stress. My hopes and dreams for the world are not what the world is. And so in those moments where that becomes so plain, that generates moral stress. And It may not be at those kind of big, radical suffering kind of levels, but it could be. So what do I do with that? Well, I think one of the things that we do about that is we spend some time in community, and we look at each other eye to eye, and we say, what are we going to do in this time? And those opportunities where we do stuff together, to me, is about how do we have that kind of embodied response at that time. And to me, that's a way that we are processing our moral stress in a situation like that. So I was talking about moral injury and moral stress in reference to the particular context of thinking about military service, but some of the writing that I'm doing right now is absolutely about relocating that conversation in some different contexts. I had an opportunity at AAR last week to talk to a number of practitioners who were working with folks who were incarcerated. And they're saying, boy, I'm seeing a lot of this where I'm working. So the different contexts that we can imagine here, I think we've only begun to just scratch the surface of that conversation.
Thank you very much for your talk, and glad you're here. Wanted to see the flip side of that. I don't think you need to be embarrassed about your art at all, but it is in my interpretation, young white guys.
Oh, yeah.
What does diversity, racial, gender, and sexuality
Yep.
in the military context?
Yeah.
How does that affect your theories?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I think it's important to be able to think about moral identity in ways that are socially and relationally constructed is that, to me, that conceptual framework is actually able to engage dynamics of race, gender, and other kinds of identities in ways that we can actually kind of make sense of the story in a clear sense and figure out how to respond. Most of the folks that I serve with in the Marine Corps are not young white guys. So that's only a failing of my very limited artistic abilities, okay? And that is always coming into play in terms of our conversations with each other, right? I mean, there is already a question about what their job in the military is versus my job in the military, right? And the same kind of projections of pastoral authority that we see in many ministry contexts. So that's already getting sort of performed in the space. Military chaplains are officers, so that's another kind of authority performance that's happening in that space. And that's even before we've begun to scratch the surface of the questions that you're talking about. And all of those are so intricately involved in the ways that we hear stories and the way that we respond to each other. But to me, part of what's so important in this work is how do we develop the kind of conceptual framework that actually leaves room for those questions and even more so engages those questions actively, rather than just sort of, I mean, as we're doing now, I think, just not even talking about what we mean by moral, just like that just sort of falls out of the sky and then you've got it and then it's injured, right? Which doesn't make any sense to me because it totally makes invisible all of these intersecting identities that are so much a reality of our lives.
So I guess my question is somewhat of a follow-up to Dr. Hunt's. Increasingly, we're hearing the term the militarization of the police in America. And the militarization of the police literally means, for me, that battering rams are knocking down houses of grandma and them. That literally we are talking about a drug war that some have called failed. And at the present moment, we see war-torn communities because, you've got the military tanks coming in and the big shields and so forth. And I can just foresee that your theology could become a defense for some people who are, for lack of a better word, traumatized morally because of their beliefs. For instance, we have come to a place now where, blue blood is something that we hear a lot. And so there's not just the codification of, certain moral context about America, but it's also about another nation that seems to have committed war on its own community. Yeah. And so for me, the question becomes, does theology then sell itself short when it comes to dealing with the real tensions that happen in war-torn communities right here? Yeah. And then the second question, if you don't mind,
all right.
I was very interested in the artwork on your first slide, and I saw these sort of Moby Dick fish, And I wondered if you could kind of give us something in terms of what that all means.
That image on the introductory slide is Fritz Eichenberg. It's an etching of the Jonah story.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would recommend any of his artwork to you. You can find all that stuff on Google. But I want to get back to that first question because that's very, very significant to me. What the vulnerability that I hear you talking about in terms of what can happen with all this, we ought to always be asking that question. Because even, you're sitting around, you're thinking all this stuff, and you're thinking, hey, this is really some good stuff here. It doesn't mean that when it gets out there, it doesn't get used in some kind of way that you never saw. So that vulnerability is always there, and I appreciate you saying that. My hope is that through these conversations, if we can make these moral cultures more visible, rather than just sort of shrugging our shoulders and saying, well, I guess that's what police do. Or I guess that's what happens in those communities, right? That's kind of what I see. It's just this very superficial kind of, I guess that's just violence. It's ultimately a pretty fatalistic kind of way of approaching this stuff. And so what I hope is that in this work, there's some naming that is able to take place there, not that excuses or not that defends or lets anybody off the hook, but rather allows us to get out of our trenches a little bit, just enough, that we can just try one more time to figure out if there isn't a way for us to speak with each other with some honesty. And the stakes are so high, and there has been so much violence done that it almost sounds absurd to even say that out loud. And so that's why I appreciate the weight and the seriousness of your question. But my hope is that in some ways, could this create a space for a community to have a different kind of conversation? Because at this point, that's all I know what to hope for.
Thank you very much.